Welcome everybody to End of Days Tasting Roundtable for the Bourbon and Rye Whiskey, the first of many. I love team building experiences, so I hope you guys take a lot away from this because I had some fun doing the research. So yes, welcome team. Thanks for joining.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, taking the time for your Monday afternoon. So you're here because you want to gain knowledge of our spirits, feel confident in showing them and applying this knowledge to your EOD experience, whether it is in the Mercantile room here at the distillery or wherever you guys are in the field. Today's Bourbon and Rye Tasting Roundtable will better build product knowledge and better serve you with the customer interaction and in the field. So this is just going to make us better people overall. So, benefits of our tasting roundtable: gain product knowledge, build the confidence, and enhance your EOD experience and add to your story. Now that's something special with working with End of Days is that we get to spread our own story, and every one of us has a EOD story, and each of us is special. And that's something that I had lacked confidence in at the beginning, especially starting my tours. But it is such a beautiful thing to develop and kind of see everyone else's story develop as well. So the benefits of this tasting roundtable is going to help you address different customer bases. So we're going to encounter a whole array of different people. Ones who drink only and all bourbon, we all know them and encountered them, right? Walking into a bourbon whiskey bar, it can be intimidating. And most often those people are going to have their mindset and they already have favorites picked out. But we're going to do our job by telling our bourbon story and apply it to their liking. And then you're going to apply it to ones who don't drink whiskey, like me personally. That's something that I had to overcome. My whiskey knowledge prior to End of Days was a Jameson shot. And that's all. But it has been uphill from there. We're going to address people who don't like it. And that's something that we're going to have to kind of embrace. You don't necessarily have to like our bourbon, but one thing that we can relate to people is our story, and that's one thing customers overall can gravitate towards is a story that they can relate to and retell. And the most fun is encountering people who love it, so that's an easy sell. All right, today's tasting roundtable, so bear with me. This is the table of content. I could have made this presentation 3 hours long. I love it, so I condensed all the general information for us today. So today we're going to discuss the history and the origins of bourbon and rye. I feel like that's going to give us a better understanding of what product that we have. We're going to discuss the EOD whiskey production, because I know it is difficult being not in the facility as often as we are, or even just being in the Mercantile room, we can feel distance from what is going on in our DSP. So we're going to discuss what's happening and how Zach and Derek are holding down the fort. We're going to also go into the EOD Survivor's Cup bourbon and rye and discuss those notes and information. This is all information that we should know. It's in our tasting guideline, but it's a good refresher. And sometimes I like to kind of revisit those stories because it really helps me re-excite my selling of the bourbon and rye. And the reason why we're all here is to taste bourbon and rye on the clock. And then we are all doing this, whether it is in the Mercantile room or in the field. And that's one thing that I love is that everybody has their own individual tasting. So I think I'm going to pull some volunteers today. Just for some fun, we're going to present 2 cocktails that will help you apply the bourbon and rye. And at the very end, we'll chat and see if I didn't cover anything. All right, let's get ready for some history. To better understand our bourbon and rye whiskey, it's great to understand um, where the bourbon and rye originated from. So, prior to the 20th century, there was a wide range of unregulated distilled spirits in the United States until the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. This was passed to protect consumers from fraudulent spirits. So, if you can imagine, prior to the 20th century, it was the wild, wild west of all different spirits being produced until 1897. This was the start of the regulation. Oh, and we have Alan joining us. Oh, you are fine. Come on in. We are just starting the history of bourbon and rye. So, the Bottle and Bond Act regulated the following, right? So, this is the beginning of regulation of whiskey in the United States. So the Bottle and Bond Act regulated that distilled spirits must be composed of the same kind of spirits. I had a question about this. I'm assuming people couldn't just mix vodka and rum and call it such. So there was a little bit more regulations for the consumers. Bottle and Bond regulated that spirits are produced in the same distilling year. This goes into the recognizable bottle and bond of um, the spirit has to be made from the grains of the same year, mashed, ferment, and distilled the same year by the same maker. It also, spirits have to be stored for at least 4 years in a wooden container, unaltered with the exception of the addition of water to get the final proof to 100 proof. So this was the beginning, bottle and bond. We still have some bottle and bond on the market. I hope EOD will do that in the future because we have that ability. All right, so President Taft followed the Bottle and Bond Act with the Taft decision to legally define American whiskey by regulating what could and could not legally be added to whiskey. So this was more of the progression of defining what American whiskey was or is. So his goal was to hold these makers accountable for what they were making and importantly raise consumer awareness. Again, getting the American public more knowledgeable of what is in that bottle. This was in 1909. So the Taft decision was published at the end of 1909. It was the first time in American history that whiskey would be legally defined. It's an exciting part of history, guys. So the Taft decision in 1909 defined straight whiskey, which would continue to define what we call bourbon today. So we probably will find these definitions very similar to some of our spirits here. So straight whiskey is defined by U.S. law. It should be distilled from a fermented cereal, grain, or mash. So this would be in contrast to wine, where wine is not mashed. Straight whiskey should be distilled no higher than 160 proof, meaning after the distillation process, that whole collection should not exceed 80%. It should not go into it should not go into the barrel more than 125 proof. So we'll have to proof it down to 125, no more, in order to be straight whiskey. Age in new charred oak barrels for a minimum of 2 years. So that's another regulation of straight whiskey. Any straight whiskeys aged younger than 4 years must indicate age on the label. And the straight whiskey regulations also announce rules for definition and composition of American whiskey. This is when we define bourbon and rye by the dominant grains they're used. So bourbon is corn liquor, so at least 51% corn, and that applies to rye when it comes to the rye percentage. Straight whiskey was and is largely a matter of aging and proof assurance. Again, coming back to consumer awareness. So that was 1909. And a little newspaper clipping from December 26, 1909. The heading reads, Taft decides whiskey must be classified. And I'm going to read this first paragraph here. Whiskey is whiskey. President Taft has at last decided it is whiskey when made of neutral spirits, says the president, if reduced to a potable strength, but it must be branded so that those buying it may know just what they are getting. So this is good for the American consumers. So that was 1908, followed that by President Roosevelt enacting the New Deal in 1939. This is going to further support the definition of bourbon in the United States. This is where you're going to find the more recognizable regulations of bourbon. So the New Deal would regulate bourbon to always age in a new oak charred barrel. The type of oak is not clearly defined, but new white American oak barrels are commonly used because it's the most suitable to build a secure watertight barrel. So that is what type of barrels we're utilizing. There's a picture to the right there. Those are our barrels. White American oak with a number 3 char, and those are 53-gallon barrels. The New Deal was most likely influenced by lobbying Cooper unions in the massive timber industry. So if you guys can reference that time in history in 1938, we just came out of the Great Depression, the end of Prohibition, and we were trying to jumpstart our economy. So bourbon regulation was a result of that. So, lastly, in 1964, U.S. Congress declared bourbon as a distinctive product of the United States. Very patriotic there. The following are some recognizable regulations of bourbon that are used today. So before I go forth and cover that, there has been a lot of misconception that bourbon has to come from only Kentucky, which is not true. We do have Kentucky straight bourbon, which obviously is from Kentucky, but bourbon itself can be made in the United States, anywhere, but some do better than others. So bourbon has to be at least 51 corn mash, so it's corn liquor, aged in new oak charred barrels. We use white American oak. Not exceeding 125 proof at the start of the aging process. So that means I'm going to go check our barrels in the rick house there. And aged for at least 2 years. Now we know 2 years is a very young bourbon. We are looking, as end of days, we're looking for a sweet spot of 4 to 6 years to be that prime time for our bourbon. All right, brief history of North Carolina prohibition and liquor laws. This information might be redundant for those who give tours, but I find this history fascinating. You know, End of Days is the first legal distillery in Wilmington since the prohibition in the state. And our Survivor's Cut Bourbon Batch 1 is the first legal bourbon in Wilmington since prohibition. You know, North Carolina became one of the leading southern states to enact prohibition in 1908 before it was federally mandated. So that was 12 years before the whole United States. Federal prohibition was 1920. You know, during this time, that was a big push for that bourbon industry in Kentucky because North Carolina lost a lot of their masters distillers to Kentucky and Tennessee. And that moonshining became a common lifestyle, which resulted in what we know as NASCAR today. I love this history. Moonshiners would modify their vehicles to outrun the police to deliver liquor throughout the state. You can see that picture to the right. Fascinating and very funny history. And even at the end of the federal mandated prohibition in 1933, it took North Carolina until 1937 to recognize the 21st Amendment. So 4 years after the end of prohibition was when North Carolina decided to recognize it. And that was when the ABC Commission was set up. The distilling industry was not legally supported until 1979 in North Carolina, and this was after years of support of the wine and beer industry. So prior to opening our doors, end of days, opening our doors in April 2019, North Carolina was still ruled that distilleries were not legally allowed to serve their spirits. So we were not allowed to have a bar initially when we came into this building. We were also not legally allowed to sell more than 5 bottles, 5/5 per year to a household. So no more than a gallon per household per year. It was only 2 months into construction that legislation changed, allowing us to expand our operation. So, I mean, we are truly making history here. This is something special we're a part of. All right, EOD whiskey production. One of my favorite aspects of End of Days. And this, from your tasting notes, is going to be very familiar, but it's a great refresh. So our whiskey production is barrel to bottle. This is a phrase used in the industry just to describe a craft distillery. Barrel to bottle meaning we are mashing, fermenting, and distilling and barreling within the same facility. I also use the phrase grain to glass as well. Our whiskey are not sourced from MGP, which is the Midwest Grain Product. That is a large producer of whiskey, which people can buy or contract out, and this just gives distilleries the opportunity to sell whiskey without going through the production and bottling itself. So we're not doing that. We are small batch. We are a single barrel distillation, meaning our 500-gallon pot still, when we're distilling a batch of bourbon, only yields 1 barrel. So we're distilling 1 barrel at a time. Our whiskey ingredients are sourced from North Carolina and is naturally aged in our unconditioned rick house. So that phrase from my tours. Um, this is a very special way of aging and maturing our spirits here. We don't temperature regulate our rick house or in our production space. We allow the natural temperatures here in this region in coastal North Carolina to help mature these spirits. So our spirits are very unique. They're going to develop different flavors season by season, and this is something that we are really proud of because we're a very unique distillery. So yeah, the whiskey production here again is barrel to bottle, small batch, single barrel distillation, unconditioned rickhouse, and I do want to touch base on that again. Beth actually reminded me of this a couple of weeks ago. This our rickhouse is in a very unique situation. It is rare that you're going to find a distillery where they have their rick house and their production in the same space. So not only are our barrels maturing and developing flavors with the seasonal changes, those barrels are going to age with the temperatures of the production as well. You know, we are using our 2 million BTU boiler for production, so it does heat up the space. So our barrels are going to be affected by those changes as well. Um, so going into our corn is sourced from small local North Carolina farmers. Although our current bourbon calls for a yellow corn, we have mashed a variety of white, heirloom red, and blue corn for our future bourbons. This is exciting for me. And this is the beauty of a craft distillery. And I want to use the word craft distillery and kind of use the word independent distillery as well. We don't have a set bourbon recipe, number one, because we're young. So we want to emphasize the unique spirits that we are producing here because of the passion behind of the product and the ingredients. So our grains, such as our two-row barley, wheat, and rye, are sourced from Riverbend Malt House, based out of Asheville. And for y'all who didn't know, our spent grains are donated to Farmer Ray, based out of Burgaw, North Carolina, so he can feed his livestock. So we love that sustainability that we can apply to our production. And let's get into, now we covered the history, we covered the origins, we covered what we're doing in production. Now let's talk about the star EOD Survivors Cut Bourbon. This picture right here is that first initial release. It was our first batch. So it was history there. I see Matt in the picture right over here. So our first batch, Survivors Cut Bourbon, was released fall 20 of 21 as a limited batch. Again, going back to how special it is the first legal bourbon in Wilmington since Prohibition in the state. Batch 1 bourbon was released from 2 barrels, limiting the amount bottled. It quickly sold out. We had 2 releases. The first sold out, and this was the first release with that line around that building. I wasn't a part of the team then, but just having Matt, my husband, being a part of that event was very special to me. So I know how special it was for everyone else. It sold out in 45 minutes, and the second release I was a part of, and that was really, really cool. Sold out within a day. Batch 1 bourbon was aged 2.5 years, but it allowed us to set a foundation of our future bourbons. Again, as we're aging and maturing as a business, as a distillery, those small releases of our whiskeys will come to surface. And we currently have batch 2 bourbon available. Just a little showcase of the first release there. We got the line. We got Tyler Earls and Beth there with our mass days. Survivors Cut Bourbon Batch 2. Now, I just want to say, I need to tell Matt that he needs to start looking at me the way Tyler is looking at this bourbon bottle. So that is some love right there. But batch 2 bourbon, let's get the breakdown. And again, these are in our tasting notes. We know these facts, but it's a great refresher. Our batch 2 bourbon has been aged in new American oak barrels with a number 3 medium toasted char for almost 4 years. This is a 68% yellow corn mash, 22 barley, and 10% rye. Unconditioned aging, again, going back to how unique our rick house is and the climate that we experience here in Wilmington. They're going to get some of those key tasting notes of the caramel, vanilla. It's going to be bold and smooth as well as it matures. And it is 93 proof. Just going to take a moment there for Tyler and the bottle bourbon. Survivors Cut Bourbon tasting notes. So I just want to talk about this picture here. This picture is from our second release. I mean, I feel like after the first release, we kind of honed in on that system. So this is Trevor giving out samples of the bourbon and a cocktail. So again, very, very special. So tasting notes. So to understand the tasting notes, you got to understand the bourbon. So our EOD bourbon right now is barley forward. It is a single barrel distillation, small batch, fermented at 500 gallon per batch. This particular batch of bourbon has a measure of rye that is not like typical wheated bourbons that produces sweet whiskey. So a lot of popular bourbons on the market are most often wheated. We're very special. We're unique. So this one is going to have that spice of the rye, and it's not going to be that sweet, but still lots of flavors. It has more characteristics than any of the commercial brands because of the small batch distillation. And we use less filtration to preserve the robust flavors from its small batch ingredients. Now, you're gonna encounter a lot of bourbon connoisseurs. People have been on the bourbon trail that ask how we filter because they're more familiar with the Kentucky bourbons that are water filter, cold water filter, or even the charcoal filter that Tennessee does. Well, we love flavor here. So we just do a very simple cloth filtration because we want to have all these flavors. We kept the bourbon at a higher proof so the craft distillation can be enjoyed. Going back to flavors, we're not afraid of flavors, and we're not afraid to kind of walk away from that generic flavor profile that bourbon is at right now. Our bourbon has a full body mouthfeel. It has a deep chew, so a lingering flavors on the palate. When you're breathing in and out, you're gonna have those pronounced flavors. It's a term people use for the aftertaste, and you can taste it well after your initial sip. Now, not an ethanol burn, but flavors. All right, scoot aside, bourbon. Let's talk about Survivor's Cut Rye, Batch 2, which is Wilmington's first legal rye since Prohibition. So our rye has been aged in new American oak barrels with a number 3 medium toasted char for 3.5 years. 65% rye, and we're going to talk further on about this. Rich, smooth, spice finish with a caramel color. I really favor our rye. It is such a flavorful whiskey, and even for a person who doesn't typically drink whiskey. Coming in with those caramel and vanilla. Caramel and vanilla is actually a natural flavor from white American oak barrels, and the rye is going to introduce some honey and spice as well. And it is 93 proof along with the bourbon. So Survivor's Cut rye tasting notes. So in contrast to most rye whiskeys on the market, our rye is highly approachable with more complex flavors. So let's talk about our rye mash. We kept it down to 65, which again, approachable. A lot of ryes on the market, I thought ranging from 75 to 90, but most of them are going to run about 90 to 99. So if you can think about that, that is high spice and very overwhelming for people who don't particularly like that flavor. So we wanted to keep those bold flavors. Sorry. Bold flavors, but keeping that rye spice as well. The wheat in the rye recipe is going to bring out some softness in that mouthfeel as well. Vanilla sweetness from the oak and caramel from the toast. Packed with flavors and ultra smooth with hints of spice. Again, I love our rye. It is Flavor Town. All right, let's taste. So before we're gonna go into our group tasting, I kind of want to go over some typical whiskey tasting protocols. So here's some suggested ways to taste whiskey. Use a Glencairn glass to allow better identification of aromas and viscosity. Now I know that is not practical for those who are giving tastings, but we can apply the same for our tasting cups. I believe so. So you want to pour the whiskey just under the widest part to allow swirling, just like the picture displayed, just under the fattest part. And if you want to do that with the tasting cup, I would do just below that. So you just allow some space for you to swirl it into this tasting cup. You're going to swirl it. Open up those different aromas. You know, you've heard it. Let it breathe, right? As it hits the air, all those flavors are going to open up. You're going to check the color. A lot of people do this. And you're going to tilt it a little bit, and you're going to check the thickness, how the viscosity of it. Now you're going to take a nose for different scents. Now you can take your nose all the way in here. Now, if you just smell pure alcohol, I would suggest you just pull away. Pull away until you can get some different tasting or different scents. And you can apply that to the Glencairn as well. So if your nose is in the cup and you're smelling just pure ethanol, pull it away until you can smell. And you can even swirl it and you can smell it from here. Now, take a small sip, and we'll all do that. You're going to take a small sip, and then you're going to let that whiskey kind of sit on your tongue, pucker a little bit, and do a little O shape. because you're gonna basically cover your taste buds with this whiskey to detect all those flavors. I'll tell you, it's very difficult for me. So at this point, you're going to pull the whole experience. You're going to identify the aroma, the taste that you found. You might ask, what is it called when it burns down all the way? That's the finish. When observing the finish, ask yourself, does it burn for a long time? Is it short? Is it pleasant? Is it rough? So those are some things that you can detect. Please remember, in any tasting, please just take it slow, and that everyone interprets different notes. So I pull different flavors, um, different flavors than Natalie would, and that's why one thing I do love is sitting in a tasting of or other team members is that I can get different notes, but we're all sticking to the same keywords. So each team member will interpret, like just I mentioned, will interpret their own tasting notes, but remember just to focus on our key points. So let's feature some team members to give their tastings of each spirit. All right. Do we have a video volunteer to give a tasting of the bourbon? And we're going to volunteer somebody here to give a tasting of the rye. Oh. So any bourbon volunteers? Oh, that's right. No? That's right. No? Oh, that's right. Bourbon? Well, and it's okay. Oh, there you go. Darius, this is your opportunity. You got to give us your spiel.
I definitely don't have a spiel, but I'm picking up hints of nutmeg for some reason.
Okay, and that would be the spice. So to the nose, I get the honey and the rye spice right off the bat. Color is good. The viscosity is awesome. Like, look at the legs. They call it legs, or how much it sticks to the side of the cup. So you take that nose, and then we can take it to our lips, and then we can taste. For me, I get the spice forward. I get that honey, caramel, vanilla. Now the finish, some mild burn for me, but that caramel and honey really lingers for me. Yes, Kristen.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
It's interesting. I hadn't actually, when you were talking about how the rye is used and it's not a wheated bourbon, having that in the back of my mind and then tasting it, it's like I can absolutely tell it. I mean, maybe I'm just not used to the taste of bourbon, a barley bourbon so much, but it was like this unique nuance there that I hadn't noticed before. So
Barley would be different notes. You can get chocolate notes from barley. You can get very cereal sweetness notes from barley as well. Shane, you can chime in if you would like as well.
Or maybe it was the rye. I mean, the rye that's in there that I'm noticing.
Yeah.
No.
So we do. I mean, this is the bourbon, and with that, was it 10% rye? Mm-hmm. We're gonna get that spice, which is typically not common in a bourbon on the market.
Yeah.
So as I'm driving and I'm swirling and tasting. Yeah, no, I love this, guys. This is wonderful. I wish I could be there tasting with you guys. I will say that, bourbon is always made from corn, 51% or more. It's always made with barley, a two-row malted barley normally. And then it's going to be either wheat or either rye. So it's going to be one or the other. And this particular one is made with a rye. So it's going to have a little bit more of a spicy note on it. It'll be less rounded than wheat, less sweet than wheat. And this is more of a very old traditional recipe bourbon. And wheat came in the picture, which right now our recipe is calling for wheat. And we even took it a step further and went with a smoked pecan wheat, which will bring out a even more flavor, more of like a smoky flavor going forward. What's nice is we've laid down barrels of everything, of rye, of wheated bourbons, and smoked wheated bourbons. So now we get to kind of play around and see what the future holds when we go in and feast the barrels and see how those flavors are developing. And then as we age, and it was like, you know what, I think I like to blend a wheated bourbon with a rye bourbon. And that becomes your blending process, that is truly an art in itself, is the blending processes of bourbons. So it could be a quarter rye and 3/4 wheat bourbon. Those are all, and what they do is, that's in the future, obviously, but that's when you do special releases of a particular blend. I just thought I would share that.
Love it. Thank you, Shane. Go ahead, Darius.
My question actually is for Shane. And Al, you may know this too. Shane, like what kind of flavors are you looking for in the final run of the bourbon and rye?
Well, I wish I could say that I knew. I wish I could say that, hey, I got all this like 20 years of experience working for Maker's Mark or whatever. I just know that I appreciate like deep flavors, which is one of the reasons I love the rye the most. However, I will say that our sweet spot seems to, just in my guesstimation, it's going to be somewhere between 5 and 6 years of bourbon. And when you create a bourbon right off the bat and it's coming out of the still as that white dog that we talk about, you can kind of tell if it's going to be a decent bourbon. But overall, you don't want it to pick up notes of like pure ethanol where it's real nasally and it tastes like jet fuel. You want to pick up notes of obvious, there's obvious things in a bourbon, and that's the sweetness of corn, the softness of wheat, the spiciness of rye, depending on which one you're using. You're always going to get some type of like deep caramel notes. And then those caramel notes can turn into cinnamon and clove, nutmeg, all of the deeper notes of spice. And then you're going to get vanilla, some of the lighter aspects, vanilla and caramel and honey from the type of barrel, the toast of the barrel, and the char of the barrel. So there are so many little factors that go into each one. And which is why we still, I was asked by the Beverage Network to do like a little maturation question. And I said, we're still in recipe development. I mean, 3 years later, we're still developing recipes because there's too many options and there's too many run-of-the-mill bourbons right now. And bourbon, I keep up with this particular bourbon newsletter. And I kind of saw this coming. MGP is mass-produced bourbon coming off of a still that never stops. It's 24 hours a day, just continuous still distillation. And they're producing massive amounts of bourbon that are going into barrels, millions of barrels. And we're kind of getting the same run-of-the-mill bourbon, and it's going to come to a head. So what will distinguish a distillery is going to be the craft part of how is this different than an MGP product? If that's a super long answer to that, but we are still in recipe development. However, I will say we increased our corn just a little bit, backed off the barley, because there's, I think, going back to your question, in the very beginning, I felt that the barley was a little too forward, but that was at 2 and 3 years, right? But now that it's coming into 4 years, the barley has already backed off of the nose. So maybe I shouldn't have changed it at all. Maybe the barley would have naturally come out at 5 and 6, and you have something spectacular. We're also dealing with very distinct barrels that we will not be able to reproduce again because that guy's dead and he doesn't produce barrels anymore. So those are all like little extenuating factors. It's a fascinating industry to be a part of.
Thank you, Shane. That was awesome. And I kind of want to touch base on more of the craft distilling part as well as we apply that to our interactions with selling the bourbon or talking about the bourbon. You know, you're going to run into a lot of opinions, but one thing that we can emphasize is that we're producing unique bourbons, and maybe they don't like this batch, but we're having fun here at the distillery with all these different recipes, and that is the upside to being a young in recipe development phase, is that we're going to have some delicious blue corn bourbon, red corn bourbon, and it's just very exciting. So that's one aspect that I speak upon during my tasting, is that, you know, this is one recipe, but I am so looking forward to the future of what else we can make. So hopefully that can apply. Go ahead, Morgan.
So once we've used the barrels, what do we do with them afterwards?
So we cannot reuse it for bourbon due to the regulations, but because we're a young distillery, we're gonna try to reuse it as much as we can. We'll start blending different spirits in it. So to our discretion, the used bourbon barrel right now, we have an American single malt. We have a couple American single malt in used bourbon barrels of ours. We have our agave right now in used rum barrels of ours. So it depends on the barrel, and if it can keep its liquid, we would reuse it. So usually 2 or 3 times. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Shane.
No, Allie, you're spot on. We just for a sales perspective,
Yep.
when people ask you guys that, you can very confidently say, and you can always start with bourbon if you want. You know, we always use a new American oak barrel for that. We turn our ex rum barrels into American single malt barrels. And then for our rum, we use our rum barrels 2 times. We use our gin barrels 2 times. Our gin barrels are sold to cideries, breweries, or to the public. And our rum barrels are usually sold to the public, breweries, cideries. And then we will also reuse those rum barrels for, you know, like agave. So you're spot on that. In a sales perspective, be able to confidently say what it is we do with them, because people like that to know. And you can reuse a barrel for years upon years, 50 years, if you keep them in good shape and moist and you have spirits in them. They'll last for a very, very long time.
Awesome. Alan, may I volunteer you to give the rye tasting? Yes, we're gonna volunteer Alan here.
Well, I always point out the mix for the tastings. If people are doing the tasting, we have a rye, wheat, and a barley mix. It's 65% rye, which I think is important to them. And I always tell them this is very true to a rye. I am a fan of rye. I think you get the pepper notes on it a lot, but you also get the herbal earthiness that comes from. It's a sharper flavor than your bourbon, obviously. Bourbon is a lot smoother and sweeter because it's corn based, but the rye still has this really unique flavor profile that I think not everybody likes a rye, but from what this is, I think this is really well done. So I bring out the vanilla notes. You know, you obviously get the barrel taste, but you get the very distinct rye that comes through. The bourbon also has a little pepper to it, but this really does, I think, more, obviously.
Yeah.
You know, I also, for some reason,
Ooh,
at least
yeah.
everybody's taste profile is a little different. I get a little nuttiness on it too.
Yes.
I do, but maybe Brazil nut. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being stupid, but I just get that some of that element as well.
No, and that's the beauty of individual tastings. I mean, we're gonna have different taste buds.
thought this changed, but maybe it didn't. I thought it was,
Go
this
ahead.
is 65% rye. Yeah.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Darius.
Some of the tastings I do, people always point out that in a profile they pick out a sweeterness from the rye than they do the bourbon, which is typically unusual because, of course, with bourbon and the corn, you're going to get more sweeter notes. So, what is that? What is that they're picking up from the rye? Is it the rye itself, or is it something else?
That's a Shane question.
You know what? Most people that have tasted a rye normally start with what's called a high rye at 100% or 95% rye. So they're going into the tasting thinking it's going to be super spicy and I'm not going to like it. I think our rye is very approachable for the 65 to 67% of the rye. And the sweetness is definitely coming from the wheat. And it is more pronounced in this particular rye. I don't know why. Maybe because of the ratios, the percentages, they work out to be that way. And I have found the exact same, some people say, I actually like this rye because it seems sweeter than the bourbon that you have. Also remember that bourbon at 93 really shouldn't be 93. It should be 45 is what most people are used to drinking. And so you're still getting quite a bit of alcohol on both of those. But for the rye, I was totally taken back. Personally, it's my favorite spirit on the brown side.
Yep.
It's got great taste, great notes, and it's very approachable to get into the category of rye. And I always recommend when you're pushing this on the sales side of things is to really push the uniqueness of rye compared to bourbon. Bourbon is bourbon is bourbon. But rye allows you much more flexibility in the barrel and the mash bill. And so if you are really a whiskey connoisseur and you only stick to bourbon, you become boring to me. That's what I think in my own head. So I kind of like get them to think outside the box and get into the rye movement and open up your palate. So kind of turn it back on them. When they say, "Oh, I don't like rye. I don't like rye." Open your palate up. Expand your mind.
Love it. Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
That's good. And Darius, I agree to some point. The bourbon is, but I think the bourbon is a little flatter taste. When you have the rye first and you do the bourbon, it's a drier, flatter taste. The rye is very sharp, and I think you do get some sweet element on it too. You do. Yeah, they're both good, but I really particularly like the rye more than bourbon. It's it,
One last comment for everyone when you're drinking this is that, and this is a great talking point for those that are out in the field, and you say, just remember that this is a 93%, or a 93 proof bourbon or rye. And one of the reasons for that is allows you to water this down without diluting the taste. So if you're sipping on bourbon and rye, normally you're going to put it over a block of ice. And that allows you to put this bourbon or rye over ice, allow that melting of the ice, and then the melding of it. And I got to tell you, that allows you to have it at 45 true. If you pour it at 45, you're going to get it into the 40. It dilutes it too much.
That's a good point, Shane, especially with usually a lot of people would like to have some water ice in it with the whiskey tasting. Lizzie.
I did want to go back to what Alan was talking about with the tastings. I always do bourbon before rye because I've had a lot of customers talk about how the rye flavor, it lingers so long that if you try the bourbon after it, you're not going to get as much of an experience.
Yes, and he agrees. I wanted to touch base on that. I'm glad you reminded me. I had started doing my tastings like that as well, starting with the bourbon. It's because a little bit sweeter, more approachable, but that rye is so robust. You kind of want to end your tasting with the rye because after that, your taste buds are kind of depleted after that. But yes, I'm glad you spoke on that, Lizzie. Awesome. All right. Any other rye questions? So we're just going to, we got a couple more on the slideshow, and then we'll just end it with a brief questioning. So yeah, so thank you everybody. And again, let's just remember that um, everyone is going to have their individualized tastings, and I really do love hearing other tastings, and I take away from my own. Just remember to touch base on those facts that are in your tasting guides. I'm just going to end with a couple of cocktail recipes. So this will help you guys, whoever you're speaking to, kind of help utilize the bourbon and rye. So I want to feature a new cocktail for the bourbon, which is the Survivor's Cut Sunrise. It is the take on the tequila Sunrise. But it is 2-ounce bourbon, an ounce and a half passion fruit, lemon and grenadine, a half an ounce of that, shaken and served over ice. Really, really refreshing. And this is something that Evan is going to print recipe cards on. So I will follow up on Evan for that. A Survivor's Cut rye cocktail recipe. A great one to kind of to relate or share with customers would be our Midtown Manhattan. A Manhattan is a classic cocktail for a rye, very simple with the 2-ounce rye, 1-ounce sweet vermouth, and the 2 dash bitters with the cherry garnish. Again, just something very simple and classic. But aside from the Sunrise and the Manhattan, we all know that the classic old fashioned is a great cocktail for our whiskeys. All right, let's just remember everybody to celebrate at the end of your day. And this is where we're going to just discuss a couple of questions. I know we reached our hour mark. I thought we were going to run over. This is perfect. But again, thank you everybody for joining us on this first official tasting roundtable.
Fabulous job, guys. That was really awesome. Great job, Allie.
Thank you.
Great job, Allie.
Nice
so much,
questions.
Allie.
Crushed it.
Nice
So
work.
fun. That homework was so fun. I can't wait to do it for tequila.
I was not expecting a PowerPoint. That was amazing.
Was.
Yes, if that will be available for reference, and yes.
And I
We
love
can-
that you delved into the history too. That was
Yeah, that was a nice touch.
What better way to understand our product? I mean, you guys got to remember, we're a part of history right now. We're making history. Not only are the first legal distillery and the first bourbon, but just producing the product itself stems from such deep history that we're all a part of. I mean, we live in the country, so. Yeah, there's my passion there. So any questions about what we learned today and how we can apply that to the field? That sounds good because it sounds like I did my job. Okay. Well, we got a couple here from Brooklyn, so.
Okay. Does aging it in the barrel raise the alcohol content? Because you said that it can't be above 125 proof.
Mm-hmm.
So as it ages, then it raises the content.
It depends on climate, and you can maybe help me with that, Shane. The question was, aging it in the barrel, and for bourbon, it has to go in the barrel for 125 proof. Does it affect the percentage coming out? My answer would be depending on the climate. In cooler temperatures, like you find in Scotland, those temperatures are cooler, which is going to keep that alcohol level right? If you come in here anytime, Shane.
I was just listening to you, Gally. I love it.
And I'm assuming, that is going to not raise in a cooler climate. What was that?
So, yes. So it depends on, like, if you're in Texas versus North Carolina. Humidity, heat, and coldness. Sometimes it can pull water out of the barrel, and that increases the proof. Sometimes it will pull the alcohol out and decrease the proof, so that it goes into the barrel at 125 and it comes out at 124. Ours seems to be very equal in pulling out equal amounts of water and alcohol. So the proof that we've been putting it in at, which is a good thing, because you wouldn't want it to just be pulling out a bunch of alcohol and leaving water, and then lowering your proof. So sometimes it goes up, like in Kentucky, depending on, some of these barrels are 10, 12 years old. It pulls out enough water where it actually goes up into the 130 mark. So I haven't had that experience yet.
Darius.
Speaking of H2O, with Kentucky bourbon, they say it's the water because it has more limestone. Like, do we filter our water before you put it in, or is there any kind of process that affects the H2O that we use?
Yes. So we proof our water with reverse osmosis water. And the unfortunate part of what we don't have is limestone water. I will tell you that is part of the Kentucky story. It is what they kind of pride themselves on, but some of the best bourbons in the world are not coming from Kentucky. Some of them are coming from Texas, from Kansas, Ohio, Missouri. Like all the MGP is coming out of like Indiana.
Yep.
And yes, they do have limestone, but it's the one little caveat that they kind of stick to the East and West Coasters to say, oh, you don't have that. But the bourbon's still coming out great. So, I always say we take really, really good care of our water, and we only use the very best. We do reverse osmosis when it comes to proofing, and we do our very best in making sure that it is the highest quality water. And then I move on. I don't dwell on that point.
Focus on the unconditioned aging and how unique that is. And next question.
I have something else to add.
Yes.
Okay.
Tyler.
So I think, Shane, you told me this one time, the story behind how we got the Survivor's Cut name. Every time I share this story to customers, everyone seems to love it. I mean, it's very interesting with correct me if I'm wrong. So the Angel's Cut is what we lose to evaporation in the barrel. The Devil's Cut is what soaks up in the barrel. And then the Survivor's Cut is what we're left with, the product. So just kind of little Angel Share. Is that the? Yeah, and then Devil's Cut. Okay, cool. That was right.
Yep. And I just started hearing Lizzie share that story during her tastings, which I personally have never shared. And it is a very special part of our story as well. So the name Survivor's Cut does have a meaning.